everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're continuing our unit on economic and personal finance, Unit 3. This unit is specifically on the government and the economy. Today we're going to focus on trade and trade interdependence and how trading with other countries affects our economy in a variety of ways. A lot of cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to start talking about today is trade interdependence. Now, you're like, hey, what is that? Luckily, I'm going to teach you. So, America trades with other countries, all right? And trade with other countries is referred to as international trade because it's inter, which means outside of, inter means inside of, international, so you're trading outside your country. You have imports and exports. Imports are stuff that you're bringing into the country, all right? You're buying from other countries. Export is stuff that you are selling to other countries and that they're buying from you, all right? So when you bring imports in, you're paying other countries, and then when you're exporting stuff, other countries are paying you for products that you have. So what this will leads to is interdependence. So no country really can take care of itself in its entirety in the modern world. They interact with other countries and they buy stuff from other countries that they don't have in their country, and then they make an excess of the things that they specialize at and they sell it to other people. Because of this, countries all rely on each other. They're all dependent on each other, all right? And it's called interdependence, all right? So interdependence is a huge part of the economy in a worldwide scenario because all the countries are dependent on other countries for certain things. Now, interdependence is a very broad term because let's say China and America, we are huge trade partners, all right? America brings in more stuff from China than we sell to China. So interdependence doesn't necessarily mean that it's equal. However, if China and America both just stopped selling to each other and buying stuff from each other, it would massively negatively impact both economies because we both rely, maybe to different extremes, on each other. So, when you have stuff that you want, which, remember, we have unlimited wants in society is a big part of economics, we are constantly trying to find places that will sell us stuff that will fill our wants. Because of this, that America will constantly, and any country, constantly is looking for new markets, meaning new countries that will sell stuff to us, and new resources that help us make stuff that we can sell to other people. So trade interdependence, being reliant on other countries for international trade, which all countries are, to different extents, but all countries are, really leads countries to search out new markets and new resources so that they can either continue to supply their own wants or be able to sell stuff and satisfy other countries' wants and therefore get the money to buy stuff for your own wants. So trade interdependence is basically a big fancy word that all countries, not only do they trade with each other, they're kind of locked into it. Because no country on its own in the modern world can have everything without having to trade with another country for it. So the question here is, how does trade interdependence help countries access new markets and resources? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right. So since trade is super important, all right, the government gets involved in this very heavily. So the government isn't necessarily like, hey, give me your products. I'm going to go over and talk to this country over here, and they're going to get their products from their private companies, and then we'll come back and we'll give you the money. Trade is happening between private companies, all right? So the government, however, keeps a very firm oversight of trade. They do this so that it doesn't negatively impact society, because trade has the ability, because there's a lot of fluid parts, a lot of different economies. Trade could really mess up an economy if there is no government oversight. And we're going to talk about that here. So one of the main things that the government does to kind of control trade is they use tariffs. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So when we buy something from another country, we add a tariff to it. Sometimes we don't, but we add a tariff to it, which is like an additional tax on imported goods when it comes into the United States. You then still also have to pay sales tax and all those other taxes on it. But tariff is a specific term for taxes to things that are being brought into the country. So here's a simple example, all right? We'll just use the idea of socks. We will say that socks made in the United States cost $3 and socks made in England cost $3. However, when those socks get brought over to America, there is a tariff put on it by the United States government, a 25% tariff, and 25% of $3 is not $1. The math is off here, but it's economics. So they're adding a $1 addition to that $3 to make it $4. So now the England socks are $4 here and the American socks are $3. Which one would you buy? If they're exactly the same, you most likely would buy the American socks because they're cheaper in America, even though they're originally the same price. Why would America do this? Well, they do it to try to protect American jobs, because if they shipped them over and they were cheaper, then more people would buy the English socks and it would hurt American workers. So that's a fictitious example. Let me give you a real example, all right? So BMW, Mercedes, and I just randomly picked a BMW here. So the BMW and the Ford Fusion. I picked I'm recording this in 2023, so these are both brand new cars in 2023. So if you've never thought about this, while BMWs or Mercedes or Honda or Toyota, those cars are all over the world. You're never going to go to another country and find a Ford or a Chevy. Just not going to happen. Now, why is that? Well, let's talk about the price of these cars here. If you're an American and you want to go buy a new car, and these are the actual current prices. A 2023 BMW 3 Series, starting at, that's the introductory rate, is $44,000. All right, that's the introductory rate for that car. A 2023 Ford Fusion Active. I tried to find just two similar sedans. They do the same thing, same size car, same class. A Ford Fusion Active starting at $35,000. It's almost $10,000 cheaper. All right. So which one would you buy? Well, if you had the extra money, you might go buy the BMW if you like that car better. But the Ford Fusion, that's a cheaper car, so it's going to entice a lot of people to buy that car. However, what if I told you that it's actually cheaper to make the BMW than it is to make the Ford? And a lot of that is because American auto workers get paid so much that it makes cars really expensive in America. So Ford and Chevy cars are some of the most expensive cars on earth to produce. So if BMW, that car might only cost $30,000 to make. Well, if they ship that car over here and you have a $30,000 BMW, all right, and you have a $35,000 Ford, all right, which one would you buy? Well, people are going to buy the BMW almost every time because it's cheaper, if not a better car, depending on your preference. So what the United States government does is puts a huge tariff on imported automobiles, on BMW, on Mercedes, on Honda, on Toyota. And they put these big tariffs so that at the end of the day, the cheapest cars to buy are going to be Ford or Chevy, even though they are actually more expensive to make than these other cars. The reason the United States government does that is to protect the American automobile industry. So tariffs are designed to protect American producers and keep them from going out of business. Another thing that the government does is they create import quotas, all right? They basically say like that there's a limit on how much of a product that you can bring into a country. bring into America as to not mess up our current markets. All right. So I'll give you an example of this and a modern example of how this takes place in America present day. And it's steel. So America produces a lot of steel. However, if you notice, starting in the 70s, American steel really dropped off, all right? And so American steel is really expensive to create because you're paying American workers for it. Steel is cheaper from other countries. However, there is a lot of steel workers in the United States. But because steel production had dropped off, we do need to supplement steel from other countries. So we do need to import some. However, since it's cheaper to get it from other countries, people were like, why don't we just get it all from another country? Well, that would put a bunch of steel companies and steel workers in America out of a job. So there is a clear quota on the amount of steel that can be brought in. And the green area is the steel imports, and the white area there, that is domestic, what we are creating. And there is a very clear quota each year of how much can be brought in. They do this so that it doesn't put steel workers out of business. Now, because you're basically mandating that these steel prices, or that the cheaper steel can't be brought in, guess what happens to the price of steel in the United States, since people are forced to buy the more expensive steel? Not surprisingly, the price goes up. We could really lower the price of steel if we just imported all of our steel. However, it would put a ton of people out of work, and it would really, really hurt a huge section of the population in the United States that works in the steel industry. So quotas are used in order to protect specific industries a lot of times. Another thing that the United States government has is sanctions, and this is the economic weapon. This is actually a book called The Economic Weapon, but it pretty much is. Sanctions, because we're all connected, interdependent, we all have to trade. If a country is doing something messed up that we don't like, and especially if a bunch of countries don't like it, they can all get together and put sanctions on the country they don't like. And what that means is, we're not going to trade with you. You can't come sit at the cool kid table. If a country puts sanctions on a country present day, it is pretty severe. Here is an example of North Korea. So North Korea, they were making nuclear weapons, and a lot of the world was very concerned about them getting nuclear weapons and told them to stop, and they said no, and they keep trying to develop nuclear weapons. So we said, until you stop, we're going to put sanctions on you. And this graphic here, 49 countries, hundreds of countries put sanctions on it. 49 countries have actually violated that, meaning that they traded with them anyway. The reason that's important to talk about is, so these countries are like, oh yeah, it's so awful that North Korea is doing that, we're not going to trade with them. Well, once North Korea stops getting trade into their country, they're willing to pay a lot more money for the stuff because it's supply and demand. And these countries are like, oh, I was all against these no nukes, but they're going to pay a bunch of money. And these 49 countries have actually violated these sanctions on North Korea, meaning they promised they wouldn't trade with North Korea because they were breaking all these rules, but then they did it anyway. And this goes to show the power of interdependence. But North Korea, while putting sanctions on them, like, oh, all these countries violated it, they must be doing fine. They are not. Their trade has absolutely plummeted. And while this is not like 100%, in a grand scheme of things, it's devastating to their society, and they are struggling for food or supplies or anything. In America and the rest of these countries, like, we will open back up trade with you, just stop trying to use nukes. And North Korea's response typically is, you're trying to starve our people to death. This is literally the reason that we need a big military to defend ourselves. It goes back and forth. But sanctions are like an economic weapon that you can use to try to keep countries. We have sanctions on Iran for nuclear development as well, on Russia, on Syria for some human rights violations. So sanctions are used against countries, and while you're like, oh, you think that's a slap on the wrist, sanctions are a legit severe punishment for a country. So the question here is, what is the main effect of tariffs on trade interdependence. So let me clarify that, because this is why I like having these questions, because I want to make sure I talk about this here. So we like trading with each other. When you jack up the price of stuff coming into America, like BMW, as the example that we used, is a German car. Germany probably isn't a huge fan that we have jacked up the price of BMW automobiles, because they can't sell as much to us because they're more expensive in America. So therefore kind of hurts that trade. You know what Germany does in response to that? Since they can't sell all their BMWs in America, they have to make sure they sell their BMWs in Germany, and they can't have competition from Ford and Chevy. So anytime Ford and Chevys get shipped all over the world, the price of them skyrockets. So they're already really expensive. So that Ford Fusion in Germany, while the Ford or the BMW you can probably buy for $30,000, the Ford Fusion might cost $55,000. And because of that, nobody buys Ford Fusions anywhere on earth, and that hurts trade. So tariffs, right, while they are designed to protect your own economy, they can hurt international trade and trade interdependence. So putting tariffs on stuff coming in from other countries is a very delicate maneuver, because it usually actually hurts your trade with the other country while you're trying to protect your own society. All right, so answer that, pause me, and we're moving on. All right. So let's start here talking about an exchange rate. All right, this is another way the government is involved here with trade. So an exchange rate talks about, and the official definition here is, an exchange rate is a rate at which one currency will be exchanged for another currency that affects the trade and movement of money between countries. So what that means is, when you're buying and selling stuff from different countries, they all use different money, and money has different values in different countries. So how much is Chinese money or Japanese money or the yen in the United States versus how much is the dollar worth in China or Japan? Because they all use different money. So the exchange rate is really important for everybody to understand what the exchange rate is. So here's the simplest way I can describe it. So money buys the same thing. So this is an example of Dunkin' Donuts. Say they have this is actually, it was an advertisement, I don't know how many years ago this was. It says $1 medium coffee on tax day, all right, which would have been April 15th if you were paying attention the other day. So the $1 medium coffee, well, that is obviously in American money. So in the United States, $1 US, and I picked this from a random day. These comparisons change all the time. Like daily, these numbers will change just a small bit from here and there. So the US dollar, this is $1. How much do you have to buy this coffee? Well, it's $1. So on this day, if you had $1 American dollar, you could buy the Dunkin'. However, the euro, all right, which is what the European Union uses for money, you would only need 91 cents, and that would buy this coffee. Now, if you go to Dunkin' with other countries' money, they're probably not going to take it. But theoretically, 91 cents is the same value as $1 on this given day. The British pound sterling is 77 cents. Swedish krona, you would have it wouldn't be $9, it'd be 9 kronas, 0.6, $9.60 in their money. Norwegian is $9.20, Icelandic krona. So Iceland, $126. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Keep in mind, their salaries are probably, they all make millions of dollars because their money isn't worth as much. So $126. So all of this is equal to $1. Like $126 in Iceland will mean that if you, hey, happy birthday, person from Iceland, here's $126. They're like, great. That's the equivalent of getting like $1 in America, all right? So the exchange rate, this is really important to know when you're buying and selling stuff, of how much everybody's money is worth, because keep in mind, it's kind of like Tinkerbell, it's kind of made up. So every country has their own version and how they value it, all right? But you have to compare people's money to each other to know how to trade with them when you're using different monies. All right. The next thing that is really important that the government wants to really focus on is the balance of trade. All right. So the balance of trade is the difference between the value of a country's exports and imports for a given period. It would be great, because we're all interdependent, that we exported the same amount that we imported. All right. That is preferred. You sell the same amount as you bring in. All right. That is balanced trade. All right. However, that is very rare to be nice and neat and balanced like that. Usually countries either have a deficit, and this is what America has, right? Where we import more stuff than we export. That is a deficit, all right? A surplus is when you are exporting a whole lot more than you're importing. Surpluses are not as bad as deficits. When you are dependent on another country, like interdependence, but you're in a huge deficit, that is dangerous, meaning you can't produce a lot of the stuff that you need in your country. And if the other country starts to have some type of economic issue, you're in trouble because they may not be able to sell to you. If you have some type of economic issue and you can't buy it from them, that puts you in trouble. Having a trade deficit kind of puts the economy in a precarious situation, because you are so reliant on like specific stuff to survive. Whereas if you're balanced, all right, and one country struggles, you're making enough money by your exports that you're selling to be able to buy it from other countries. But trade deficits mean that you are importing more than you're exporting. Like you buy stuff from people, but they don't necessarily want what you got. And then a surplus is when you are exporting more than you are importing. And of these two, having a surplus is better. However, when you have a surplus, a lot of times you're not as politically connected to these other countries because they are not as reliant on your money, just your stuff. Anyway, so the question here is, explain the difference in trade deficits and surpluses as it pertains to a trade balance. So explain what a trade deficit is and what a surplus is and why it would be really bad to have a trade deficit. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So you can't talk about trade without talking about the massive importance of cultural exchange. If you had me for world history, we talked about this. May have talked about it some in civics. If you had me for U.S. history, we absolutely talked about this. We talked about the Columbian exchange, really in both those classes, but in world history, let's go all the way back to world history and talk about this is as old as time. All right, not quite that old, but trade leads to a cultural exchange. All right, this is the Silk Road, ancient from China. That when you start trading with other countries, all right, you're not just getting goods and services from them. There's a lot of interaction between the people, and different people have different cultures. And people usually are like, hey, that's a cool way of doing things. We've only been doing it our way. That's cool. And there's a lot of appreciation between different cultures. So countries that trade very heavily with each other are usually on good terms, even way back in the day here, all right? So modern day, like in America, we trade very heavily with a lot of countries, and we have to stay on good terms with them because we want their stuff and they want our stuff. So what this leads to, this cultural exchange, is the appreciation of the other countries, and this leads to tourism. Now, you might not realize how important tourism is to an economy. It is very important, all right? So these are the top 10 most visited tourist countries, all right? And notice, these countries all trade heavily and typically try their hardest to get along with people. France, because of Paris, France is also right there in the central hub of Europe, so people can just drive there from other places of Europe. A lot of history there in France. Number 2 is America. Keep in mind, if you want to visit America, you got to travel, probably, unless you're coming from Canada or Mexico, you got to travel across an ocean, either the Atlantic or the Pacific, to get here. So the fact that America is only slightly second on this list is crazy. But we trade so heavily with other countries, people are like, oh, go check out America, see if it's like it is on the movies. And so you got Spain also there, beautiful areas of Spain. Is there in Europe, you could drive to those. China. Now China, being a much more closed off country than the other ones, it is interesting that many people are wanting to visit China because, again, China trades with tons of people. People are interested and they travel to China. Italy, United Kingdom, Turkey, Ukraine, surprisingly here. Obviously, this is before the Russian invasion. But these countries, while a lot of them are in Europe, tourism and cultural exchange is a byproduct of having a healthy trade with a lot of countries, and tourism brings in a ton of money for a bunch of countries. So the question here is, how can cultural exchange and tourism be connected to benefit an economy? So how does cultural exchange, trade, and then tourism, how are those all connected? And how does that end up helping out an economy? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so trade dependence, all right? This is not what you want. So trade dependence is when everything that you do involves either exporting or importing. Having a healthy trade relationship with other countries is great, all right? That's fantastic. When you become trade dependent, exports or imports means the only way you survive is by trading. It puts your economy in a precarious situation, because if the only way you are making money or losing money, either making money or that you're bringing supplies in, if the only way that is happening is by interacting with other countries, if those other countries decide to stop trading or stop buying your stuff, then you don't really have control over your own economy. So while America is in this deficit, I do want to give you this example here. So this is economic dependence on exports and imports. Korea, all right, specifically talking about South Korea here, I would assume, because there's, anyway. So Korea, most of their economy, not quite most, not over 50%, most of their economy, again, I'm saying most again, is reliant on other countries to provide them with stuff. They're buying it, all right, but if the rest of the world's like, oh, we're not going to trade with Korea anymore, it would be devastating. This is why it was so devastating for North Korea. Germany exports, while it's great to have more exports than imports, when it's that massive amount, if people decide they don't want to buy that from you anymore, you don't have other ways to turn. You can go all the way down here. Number 19 on the export is the United States. Only 7.5% of our GDP is exports, and only 11.4% of our GDP is imports. So while we definitely have a trade deficit, all right, where we import considerably more than we export, it is still only it's not even 20% of our total GDP. So if countries started to stop trading with us, it would hurt us economically, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. All right, so the question here is, explain how severe trade dependence, like Korea, can cause a country to be more vulnerable to an economic crisis. All right, so pause me, answer that completely. See you guys tomorrow.